Today's video uncovers the moment when a powerful tycoon, stripped of his empire, finds himself serving breakfast at an orphanage, barely able to recognize the man he once was. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Blake Montgomery stepped out of his sleek black car, the soles of his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. Cameras from the Charity Foundation followed his every movement, capturing the exact moment he handed out toys to orphans, all while smiling at just the right angles. His suit was tailored to perfection, his tie sharp, his every gesture measured. But as he reached for his wife's hand to wave at the volunteers, his eyes glanced over the children, and for the first time, a flicker of something unreadable passed through them, something beyond promotion, beyond optics. Across the room, Lily Sanders moved quietly, her chestnut hair tied back in a practical knot, her hands steady as she folded blankets and helped a little boy named Noah stack books on a shelf. No cameras followed her, no one applauded her. She worked in silence, with a kind of calm determination that made the bustling noise fade around her. When she noticed Blake, she didn't turn to greet him. She paused, one hand on the stack of books, and looked straight at him, as if weighing his sincerity with nothing more than that gaze. Blake halted mid-step. His smile faltered. He knew the charity visit was meant to highlight generosity, to amplify his image, but Lily's presence, her steady composure, felt like a single, steady light cutting through the glare of publicity. Gathering himself, he strode over, each step deliberate and precise, the posture of a man who believed he was still in control. He offered a polished greeting. "Good morning, Lily. I hope everything is going well here." His tone was smooth, practiced, but underneath lingered a question without words. "Can you see what I've built?" Lily responded in a tone that was measured but calm. "It's going fine, Mr. Montgomery. But I wonder, what value is an image if what lies beneath goes unseen?" Her words landed quietly but sharply. A hush spread through the room. Volunteers paused their work. Children halted mid-babble, and even the camera operators found themselves fidgeting. The question wasn't rhetorical. It hovered between them, clear and unnerving. Blake's chest tightened. The sound of laughter from a nearby group of children felt distant, hollow. He attempted another friendly smile, but it trembled. He looked away, clearing his throat, then turned to give a toy to a child who did not meet his eyes. He left the table, forcing himself to stay composed. The cameras captured the exit. A man in control, but a man shaken. Lily went back to her tasks. No fanfare, no watchers, just movements made with intention. Blake stepped away, hearing her words echoing. "Not what you show, but what remains unseen." It was the first crack in the facade, subtle and profound. Blake returned to the orphanage earlier than expected, this time without his entourage or the weight of a performance. He walked through the front door like a man trying to retrace his own steps, unsure whether to knock or simply enter. Lily was in the office, sorting through donation receipts and volunteer logs, her back straight, movement steady. When he asked for a moment, she glanced up, her expression unreadable. She gestured toward the chair across from her and continued writing for a few seconds before setting the pen down. The silence between them wasn't cold. It was exact, as though measured in seconds and breathed. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but controlled, asking why she had said what she did. Lily didn't rush to answer. Instead, she looked at him as if trying to decide whether he was truly asking or just protecting his pride. Then, with no emotion in her tone, she spoke of Rachel, her sister, once radiant and naive, who'd fallen in love with a man who vanished before Noah was born. She didn't name him, didn't point fingers. Blake listened with a stillness that felt foreign to him. She described Rachel's illness, her quiet death in a borrowed hospital room, and how Lily took in Noah not out of obligation, but out of a promise whispered into Rachel's ear the night before she passed. Blake didn't interrupt. He kept his hands on his lap, but the muscles in his forearm twitched. He looked away only once, toward the window, the street, anything to pull his gaze from Lily's unflinching eyes. The words hit with precision. Rachel hadn't asked for money, not even recognition. She'd only wanted to be seen, heard, and believed. Lily spoke of those final months with an intimacy that revealed her own scars, loss that shaped her, not broke her. As her voice softened near the end, Blake found himself gripping the edge of his seat, breathing as if the air had thickened. When Lily gestured toward the adjacent room, where Noah sat quietly drawing, Blake followed her gaze. The boy was humming to himself, unaware of the conversation his life hovered around. "He doesn't know who you are," Lily said plainly. "He doesn't need a name. He needs people who stay." Her voice wasn't cruel, but it was firm. She wasn't trying to provoke, she was drawing a boundary. "I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm asking you to decide whether you want to know what's behind the picture you've painted." The offer was neither invitation nor accusation. It was a simple, brutal truth. Blake stood to leave, nodding once, unsure if he'd spoken aloud at all. As he exited, he passed by Noah's room again. The boy looked up, their eyes meeting briefly. There was no recognition, no wait, just a child offering a stranger a glance. Blake stepped outside into the fading light, the silence of the street contrasting the storm inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't reach for his phone or summon a car. He walked, unsure of his destination, only knowing that something he had buried long ago had just surfaced, and it wasn't going back quietly. Blake arrived at his mansion after midnight, his steps echoing down the marble hallway, a hollow sound in a house too large for peace. He didn't call for anyone, just went straight to his study and locked the door behind him. The silence inside wasn't comforting. It amplified every internal movement, every thought, every image of Lily's steady eyes and Noah's small, curious glance. On the polished mahogany desk lay the morning's press clippings about his charity visit, glowing headlines praising a man he no longer recognized. He shoved them aside, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out an old photo album with worn leather corners. Inside, a yellowed photograph showed him as a teenager, standing awkwardly next to Rachel at a birthday party long forgotten. She was smiling with the same brightness Noah carried. That resemblance struck him now like a weight to the chest. Before dawn, Blake summoned his legal team for an emergency meeting. When they arrived hours later, still bleary-eyed, he paced the room, demanding a complete risk assessment of anything related to Rachel, to Lily, to Noah. His CFO suggested silencing the situation quietly, offer Lily a discreet settlement and a long-term trust fund for the boy. The room nodded, waiting for Blake to approve, but instead, he stood motionless by the window, the morning sun reflecting off his untouched coffee. He turned slowly, voice even but hard. "No money, no offers, no threats." The team froze. One assistant dropped her pen. No one had heard him say no to control before. It didn't sound like strategy. It sounded like surrender or something closer to clarity. That afternoon, Blake retreated to his private quarters, a part of the estate, untouched by public eyes. On the wall hung an untouched portrait of the Montgomery family, painted years earlier to project legacy and permanence. He stared at it, noting how Rachel's face had been placed in the corner, like an afterthought, like a ghost trapped in the frame. He pressed a hand to the canvas, fingers resting on her smile. For the first time in decades, his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in release. He didn't call his publicist. He didn't draft a statement. He didn't ask anyone's opinion. He simply took off his watch, folded his tailored jacket over a chair, and called for his car. Alone, when he returned to the orphanage unannounced, wearing plain slacks and a shirt rolled at the sleeves, the front desk volunteer stammered at the sight of him. No one had expected a second visit, certainly not without media coverage. Word reached Lily quickly. She walked into the reception area, her brows lifted slightly. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single photograph, Rachel and Blake, younger, laughing on a dock in Maine. "That was the last time we were real," he said, almost to himself. "Before the money, before the press, before I learned how to be someone else." Lily didn't respond right away. She took the photo, looked at it for a long moment, then returned her gaze to him, not softer, but clearer. Blake asked if he could stay for the afternoon, not to talk, not to explain, but to help. Lily said nothing, only nodded once and walked away. He followed her into the common area, where toys were scattered and small voices filled the space. No one paid attention to him. He was just another adult in the room. He bent down to pick up blocks, helped a toddler reach a shelf, held open a door. By evening, he was on his knees wiping crayon marks off a table, sweat on his brow, shirt untucked. There were no cameras, no curated moments. Just Blake, stripped of titles, surrounded by the lives that continued with or without his legacy. The phone call came just before midnight, sharp and clinical, slicing through the quiet of Blake's penthouse like a scalpel. His attorney's voice on the other end was clipped and urgent. Patrick had taken control of the board. Montgomery. Oil had shifted hands under his nose. There were documents, signed proxies, sealed mergers, private transactions unearthed in secret. But the worst was yet to come. In the next breath, the attorney spoke of fraud investigations, leaked emails, suspicious withdrawals from overseas accounts, all bearing Blake's digital signature. Patrick had used his brother's identity to reroute blame while silently building his own escape route. The company Blake had spent his life crafting, the empire he believed unshakable, had been hollowed from the inside. And now it was collapsing. With his name etched across every failing beam, that by morning, the news had spread. Headlines labeled Blake as negligent, possibly complicit. Reporters swarmed the Montgomery building, where security guards blocked cameras from the lobby. In his office, once a throne room of power, Blake sat beneath the towering oil portrait of his father, the silence around him heavy with shame. Assistants filed out one by one, eyes avoiding his. When his executive assistant tried to offer condolences, he only raised a hand and told her to go home. There was nothing to say, no rebuttal, no denial, no strategic pivot. He stared at the empty desk in front of him, now a monument to something that had slipped through his fingers while he looked the other way. The empire hadn't crumbled in a day. It had been rotting slowly, while he posed for cameras and mistook attention for legacy. Later that day, Blake sat quietly on a bench outside the orphanage, a man no longer arriving but retreating. Lily joined him, no words exchanged for several long minutes. He pulled a folded document from his coat, bank records, board memos, proof of betrayal and orchestrated ruin. His hands trembled slightly as he handed them to her. "It's done," he said, not seeking sympathy. "Everything I thought I built, it's gone." His voice held no anger, only exhaustion. Lily glanced through the papers briefly, then folded them again and handed them back. "So what remains?" she asked, her tone more contemplative than comforting. Blake stared ahead, watching a child chase a paper airplane across the grass. His tailored suit looked awkward now, creased, ill-fitting, as though it belonged to someone else. "Noise," he muttered. "Money, headlines, fear. That's all I protected. I thought I was preserving something, but I was guarding a mask." Lily didn't answer. She simply watched him as he unraveled in front of her, not in a spectacle of collapse, but in a quiet shedding of illusions. It wasn't pity she offered, only presence. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos, pouring him a cup of plain coffee. He took it with a grateful nod, and for a moment, there was nothing more between them than the warmth of a drink, shared between two people sitting in silence. When he left that afternoon, Blake didn't return to the penthouse. He drove for hours until he reached the coast, the same dock from the photo he had given Lily. He stood there long after sunset, wind whipping at his jacket, salt air filling his lungs. He could almost hear Rachel's laughter on the breeze, see her racing ahead on the planks, young and weightless. He had spent decades trying to forget this place, to erase the version of himself that once felt small, vulnerable, exposed. But now, as the tide came in and the sky darkened, Blake allowed that memory to settle beside him, not as a burden, but as the last real thing he still had. Blake returned to the orphanage early on a gray morning, dressed in a plain navy t-shirt and faded jeans, carrying a worn duffel bag. No security detail, no tinted SUV, just a man arriving on foot with a purpose he couldn't yet name. He knocked on the side door, the one volunteers used, and waited with both hands in his pockets. A teenager opened it and blinked, startled, before waving him in. Inside, the building was already alive with movement. Children lining up for breakfast, staff preparing trays, a faint song playing from a tinny radio. No one looked at him twice. Blake moved toward the kitchen, where Lily stood drying her hands with a dish towel. She met his eyes and nodded once. The gesture small, but unmistakably an invitation to stay. That he put on an apron, not knowing exactly how it worked, and began following instructions, scrubbing pans, lining up plastic cups, refilling cereal bins. The work was basic, repetitive, humbling. Hours passed in silence, not because no one spoke to him, but because Blake chose to listen more than he had in years. He watched how Lily moved without commanding, how children trusted her presence without needing her approval. A little boy tugged at his apron and handed him a crayon, asking him to draw a car. Blake obliged, smiling quietly as the child offered unsolicited advice on how wheels were supposed to look. That moment struck deeper than expected, not because of the drawing, but because no one cared who he had been outside these walls. By lunchtime, Blake was carrying trays, helping kids find their seats, wiping tables as juice was spilled. There was no applause, no reward, just motion. At one point, he stood beside Lily as they handed out meals, and for a brief second, their shoulders touched. She didn't move away. He caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, and that glance stayed with him through the rest of the afternoon. It wasn't affection, it was calculation. She was measuring his endurance, testing whether his presence would fade once the novelty wore off. And that, more than anything, compelled him to keep going. He wasn't here to prove a point. He was here to find one. Later that day, after the children had gone outside, Blake stood in the laundry room alone, folding sheets with more care than he thought he was capable of. The smell of detergent clung to his skin. His hands moved slower now, deliberate, as if each fold helped piece something back together inside him. Lily entered quietly, setting down a stack of blankets. She didn't speak at first, just joined him in the folding. The silence between them was different now, no longer tension, but recognition. She finally said, "You don't have to keep coming here, you know." Blake paused, then responded without looking up, "I know. That's why I'm here." She nodded once, and nothing more was said. When evening came and the last chore was done, Blake returned the apron to its hook. He glanced back at the empty dining hall, the chairs neatly pushed in, the quiet a stark contrast to the chaos of the morning. He stepped outside and stood under the dull glow of the porch light, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the cooling air. There was no transformation speech, no epiphany shouted into the night, just a man standing still, not as a former CEO, not as a fallen tycoon, but as someone who had spent a day doing something useful. That simple truth clung to him more than any business victory ever had. In the weeks that followed, Blake became a fixture at the orphanage, arriving before sunrise and often staying until dusk. He asked for no acknowledgement and received none beyond the quiet nods of staff, who gradually stopped treating him as a guest. His routine grew familiar, sweeping floors, hauling trash, sitting beside restless children during reading time, fixing leaky faucets with borrowed tools. The rhythm of the place began to live in his bones. But what stayed with him more than the routine was the boy, Noah. They crossed paths often, and while the child didn't know the full truth, something in him responded instinctively to Blake's presence. They shared small exchanges, a glance during lunch, a shared laugh when Blake botched a magic trick, the kind of moments that demanded no explanation and yet meant everything. One afternoon, after helping rebuild a broken bookshelf, Blake sat outside with a notebook on his lap, unsure why he was writing but compelled to do it anyway. He began a letter to Noah, not as a declaration or a confession, but as a bridge. The words were halting at first, then steadier. He spoke of mistakes made, of time lost, of a boy he wished he'd known sooner. He didn't mention Rachel directly, nor his name or title, just wrote from the inside out, allowing honesty to seep through in lines that weren't crafted but lived. When he was done, he folded the paper carefully, placed it in an envelope, and left it on Lily's desk without a word. The next day, Noah appeared during lunch with a folded sheet of construction paper in his hand. He didn't say anything, simply handed it to Blake and ran off. Inside was a child's drawing, crude and bright. Two stick figures side by side, one taller, holding a mop, the other smiling with spiky hair. Above them, a wobbly sun. It was simple, almost silly, but Blake felt something shift. It wasn't the drawing itself, but the gesture, a silent answer to his letter. He slipped the picture into his shirt pocket and kept it there for the rest of the day. That night, in the small apartment he now rented near the outskirts of town, he pinned the picture to the inside of his closet, behind the clothes. Hidden, but close. Lily said nothing about the letter. Not then, not the day after. But her demeanor changed subtly, less guarded, more observant. She began assigning Blake more trust-heavy tasks, supervising field trips, managing the supply list, reading to the younger children at bedtime. Their conversations lengthened, sometimes veering into subjects that had nothing to do with the orphanage. Books they once read, movies they never finished, places they dreamed of visiting and never did. One evening, as they cleaned up after a small birthday party, Lily handed him a plate of uneaten cake and remarked, without looking at him, "You're not who I thought you were." Blake didn't ask who she had imagined. He simply said, "Neither am I." That night, as Blake lay in bed, sleep slow to come, he thought of how little remained of the man who once controlled boardrooms with a glance. He no longer missed the spotlight. He missed only the time he had wasted in its glare. The drawing in his closet reminded him daily that connection wasn't built through power, but through presence. And presence, once earned, didn't demand anything but truth. The courtroom was colder than expected, not because of the temperature, but because of the eyes inside. Calculating, distant, many belonging to people who had once called Blake by his first name with reverence. Now he sat in the last row, unannounced, without representation, watching as the empire he once ruled was dissected piece by piece in front of strangers who treated it like just another scandal. Patrick stood at the defense table, shoulders tense, jaw clenched, his face pale beneath courtroom lighting. What had once been arrogance was now a mask cracking under the weight of evidence. Financial records, altered contracts, proxy fraud, and offshore accounts. Every accusation bore a signature trail that led not to Blake, as Patrick had hoped, but directly to himself. The courtroom's atmosphere thickened with each new witness, and when a former Montgomery board member took the stand and calmly detailed Patrick's manipulation of Blake's absence during key votes, the silence that followed felt like a eulogy. Blake didn't speak. He didn't need to. His choice to stay away from the defense and allow the evidence to speak had been deliberate. The press wanted a headline of confrontation, two brothers battling over a legacy, but Blake refused the spectacle. He wasn't there to reclaim power. He was there to witness the full collapse of the illusion he'd once helped build. When Patrick was finally found guilty, his sentencing postponed only by further investigation into international fraud, he barely reacted. He didn't look at Blake. Not once. The verdict wasn't met with cheers, only the quiet closing of laptops and the rustling of jackets. Justice, when it came, didn't thunder. It whispered. Outside the courthouse, Blake stepped into the morning, light without being noticed. Reporters clustered at the main entrance, waiting for sound bites that never came. He walked alone, turning down a side street, pulling his coat tighter. There was no joy in watching Patrick fall, only a final, hollow note to a chapter that had ended long before today. Back at the orphanage, the staff gathered briefly in the break room to watch the news broadcast. The anchor recited the charges, the outcome, and finally showed a photo of the Montgomery brothers together, taken years ago, smiling in suits in front of the company's glass tower. Lily turned off the television. "That's not the story that matters here," she said, her voice even. The others nodded and returned to their work. Later that night, Blake sat on the edge of his bed, the room dim except for the glow of a single lamp. He opened a small envelope that had arrived earlier, a handwritten note from a former employee who had testified at the trial. It said only, "I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner. You didn't deserve what they did to your name." Blake read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it next to Noah's drawing on the inside of the closet. He stared at both for a moment, one from the corporate world he had survived, the other from the new life he was learning to live. They didn't belong together, yet here they were, side by side, symbols of failure and beginning. He turned off the light, the night no longer something to outrun, but something to accept. Months passed without fanfare. Winter yielded to spring with little celebration, and Blake's life settled into something resembling rhythm, not because of grand resolutions, but because repetition had softened the sharpness of memory. He now lived in a modest apartment above a hardware store, where the creak of the floorboards and the hum of passing traffic reminded him of a world that didn't care who he had been. He rose each morning with the sun, walked to the public school just a few blocks from the orphanage, and spent hours in classrooms filled with skeptical teenagers and tired teachers. He taught ethics, not as a lecturer, but as a man who once forgot what that word meant. His lessons weren't about laws or case studies. They were stories told simply, questions posed without answers, silences allowed to stretch. One afternoon, after a quiet class on trust and responsibility, he stopped by the school office and handed the secretary a sealed envelope. Inside was a copy of Noah's drawing, now scanned and carefully reprinted, framed in a simple wooden border. He didn't say why he was leaving it. He just smiled, thanked her for her help over the past few weeks, and walked away. Outside, the sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard, and Blake paused to watch children play, a mix of chaos and joy, none of it seeking applause. He turned the corner and saw Lily waiting by the gate, not expectant, not posed. She had a bag over her shoulder, a loose sweater wrapped against the wind, and a stillness in her expression that made the noise around them fade. They didn't speak right away. They didn't need to. Blake tilted his head in a soft gesture, almost a bow, and Lily responded with a slight smile. They walked together in silence, their steps sinking slowly as if naturally falling into rhythm. At the edge of the sidewalk, Noah ran up and threw his arms around Blake's waist, clinging without hesitation. Blake exhaled, surprised but steady, and lowered himself to one knee to return the embrace. He didn't ask what the hug meant. He didn't need a word for it. His arms held the boy with a careful firmness, and for a few seconds, nothing moved except the wind. When they pulled apart, Blake looked at Lily, whose eyes had softened but stayed dry. Together, they walked down the street. No ceremony, no destination announced. Just a small trio moving forward, carrying no declarations, only the weight of their own quiet reconciliations. Behind them, the city carried on without notice. Ahead of them, the street curved gently, bordered by trees just beginning to bloom. Blake didn't try to define what was happening. He let it unfold, step by step, without naming it. In his pocket, he carried the original drawing Noah had once given him, now worn at the edges. He would never frame it. He would never show it to anyone, but he would keep it, always. Not because it proved anything, but because it didn't have to. And when they reached the end of the block and paused at the crosswalk, Blake looked up at the sky, not searching for meaning, but simply noticing it, blue, open, and quiet. Just like the moment. Just like everything that finally made sense.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Your support helps us grow and bring you even more amazing content. See you in the next one.